This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. The Harper Conservatives have a troubling record of misdiagnosing economic trends and prescribing the wrong medicine. They now brag about Canada's banking system, but in opposition, they called for U.S.-style bank regulations and big bank mergers. Once in government, they increased federal spending at 3 times the rate of inflation. They eliminated all contingency reserves and prudence factors from the budgeting process, and they put the country back into deficit again before, not because of, but before there was any recession to blame. They also loosened mortgage rules to allow 40-year amortizations, and they killed income trusts, effectively vaporizing about $25 billion from the hard-earned savings of some 2 million Canadians. 3/4 of the way through 2008, with bank failures and a recession looming in the United States, the Harper government denied that Canada would suffer a recession too. In November of that year, they prescribed austerity as the right medicine for Canada and predicted 4 more surplus budgets. Just 2 months later, they admitted that there was a recession. They flipped from austerity to stimulus, and they produced the biggest deficits in Canadian history. Their stimulus package was slow and laden with political manipulation. It clicked in late, after the trough of the recession had largely passed. It left little legacy, except for debt, and it failed to help those hardest hit, that is, young Canadians, who still face recession-like unemployment in most of Canada. By 2010, the Conservatives were back preaching austerity once again for Canadians, but practicing profligacy for themselves. So, on one side, they cut the future old-age pensions of the least wealthy and most vulnerable Canadians, especially low-income elderly women living alone, while on the other side, the most expensive cabinet in history lives in high style, tax-paid government advertising knows no bounds, 30 extra MPs, totally unnecessary, are going to be added to the House of Commons. Political photo ops go for $50,000 a pop. They're more expensive than the orange juice. And the Auditor General and the Parliamentary Budget Officer find military procurement, the biggest of government expenditures, to be incompetent and deceitful. The PBO has to go to court to get the most basic financial information about what this government is cutting. Health costs, support for the elderly, infrastructure costs, and more are downloaded onto the provinces. And meanwhile, you have robocalls and several other kinds of election fraud under investigation. Well, that's the background for the economic concerns which many Canadians have today. The clear message from the IMF, the OECD, and today from the Bank of Canada is that economic growth is going to be slower for longer. The downgrading of Canada's growth forecasts must be a reminder to the Harper government that it needs to be flexible, it needs to be nimble, and sensitive to the realities that Canadian families are facing. As the world economy struggles and slows, Canadian exports are expected to remain below pre-recession levels into 2014. So our growth in the meantime, limited as it is, will have to be fueled by domestic demand. And where will that demand come from? With the government in a monotone austerity mode, it will contribute almost nothing to domestic demand. Its impact this year is actually going to be negative, and then only very small amounts in the next 2 years, which means the bulk of our growth will have to be driven by household consumption. But there are 2 big constraints. First, slower growth internationally means lower prices for Canadian resources and therefore slower wage growth in these sectors. And secondly, household debt in Canada is already at a record high, and it will climb higher still. Many economists predict a household debt-to-income ratio at over 160% by early next year. And that was roughly where U.S. consumers were before their whole house of cards came tumbling down. Debt-to-income ratios are not the sole measure of how leveraged Canadian families are, but most economists agree that it is a good measure of how well Canadian families will be able to cope with an economic shock. It spells trouble. Rather than contenting itself with self-serving bromides about Canada being some island of stability, we believe the government should be acting in several areas. First, it should become a team player with other orders of government and with Canadians generally, less arbitrary, less unilateral, less arrogant, less complacent, and less downloading. It should begin by consulting the provinces, businesses, and employees before mangling the employment insurance system. It should also ease off its annual ongoing EI payroll tax increases, because that's a tax on jobs, and it's counterproductive at this time. The government needs a special focus on youth and students who are still living with recession-like conditions. The OECD says they could be deeply scarred for the long term. Better access to post-secondary education and skills training, a deeper commitment to science and innovation, including specifically basic research, and a simplified tax code would all be steps in a better direction. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Samantha Bayard.
Can you elaborate on what you would mean by a simplified tax code and what that would implicate?
Well, the last major kind of tax review or tax reform in Canada took place in 1971 when Edgar Benson was the Minister of Finance. That is a long time ago. Since then, there have been more than 40 budgets. Each budget has amended the one that went before. So you have 41 or 42 sets of amendments to the amendments, and the code, as a result of that, the Income Tax Act, becomes almost incomprehensible when you read through the terms of the Act. So the whole thing needs to be revisited with a view to making the tax law simpler, making it fairer, and making it clearer for Canadians to understand. It's all interrelated, so it's difficult to single out one particular thing as a place to start, because you affect one, you obviously affect something else. It's going to take a lot of good, solid work together. This is an area where you do need the teamwork that I talked about, inviting the views of the provinces and others to become engaged. But let me show you a couple of the anomalies that presently exist. The government has introduced a number of tax credits over the course of the last several years for volunteer firefighters, for children taking art classes, for home caregivers, all of which seem to have a laudable purpose. But none of those tax credits are available to low-income Canadians. They only apply, in the way they've been structured, they only apply to higher-income Canadians, and therefore that provision, as well-intentioned as it probably was, turns out to be discriminatory in the way the tax law gets applied. Would you say that a child in a low-income family is less deserving of access to arts classes than a child in a high-income family? Is a low-income firefighter less worthy of a tax credit than a high-income firefighter? But this is what you get when you amend the amendment to the amendment to the amendment over a period of 42 years. So our proposal, and this is certainly supported by business organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, this is one of their top 10 suggestions. It goes to economic efficiency, it goes to productivity and competitiveness, it goes to simple fairness in the tax system. And it's going to take a lot of work, and you can't do it overnight, but it is one thing that would contribute to the strength of the Canadian economy.
Vijay Sikorsky, iPolitics.
Yeah, and on the household debt, you echoed the concerns Mark Carney's made. What would you like to see from a fiscal policy standpoint the government do to rectify the concerns? And on the monetary policy, do you think it's time for an interest rate raise?
Well, I learned from my days as Minister of Finance that whether you're in government or opposition, you don't second guess the Governor of the Bank of Canada. So I will leave decisions about monetary policy to Mr. Carney. I think his track record demonstrates that he's well skilled in that area. But on the issue of household debt, I think he's right to sound the alarm, as he has done now for some considerable length of time. Two things that he's been saying. One is diversify your trade. Don't continue to be dominated by exports into low-growth economies. Most of our trade goes to the United States. The economy of the United States is struggling. His advice has been for some long time to attach your wagon, if you can, more effectively to the growing parts of the world. That makes sense. And I think his warnings about household debt are sensible as well, particularly at a time when the entire growth, as limited as it is, that we expect to see in the next couple of years, is going to come from consumer spending. And if household debt is obviously a damper on that sort of growth. The government has this complacent, laissez-faire, hands-off, every person for themselves, you're on your own kind of approach. And we would say there are things the Government of Canada can do to alleviate some of that burden of household debt, to help ordinary Canadian families make ends meet more effectively. We have called for a long time for a more aggressive approach to access to post-secondary education. For a lot of families, paying for post-secondary education for their kids is one of the biggest household expenditures they will face. There was a study about a year ago by the Bank of Montreal that said 50 or 60% of Canadian families didn't think they would be able to afford to send their kids to university or technical college or whatever. The government has backed away from that area of policy activity, and in our view, that would be a very constructive thing for the Government of Canada to do, to find ways to alleviate the cost burden of access to post-secondary education. Another area that needs some proactive activity is in the field of affordable housing. I know in my own community of Regina, that is probably the biggest single social issue. And it's a socio-economic issue. And the economy is obviously growing strongly in Saskatchewan and in Regina. And finding affordable housing for families of modest means is a very, very difficult challenge. Those are two areas where the government could help. Also, working more effectively on pension issues. You don't help when you cut back on the OAS. And you basically say for the average retired Canadian, you're going to get $12,000 less. And for the lowest income people, this is what's so perverse about their cuts in the OAS. For the average OAS recipient, they'll lose $12,000. For the lowest income OAS recipient, they'll lose $30,000. It's just backwards. Cost burden, rather than doing what this government has done in health and in pensions and in infrastructure and in other areas, and that is just dump the burden onto the provinces and say it's your problem. And the largest debt burden in the country now is carried by the provinces, not by the federal government. The federal government, because not any credit to the current administration, but because of the tough decisions that were made back in the 1990s, Canada has a debt ratio now that is in the low 30% range. Back in 1995, that debt ratio was very nearly 70%. It was totally debilitating. Because we brought the ratio down from 70% to about 32%, Canada has the flexibility to be able to consider some of these issues, where that flexibility may not be available in a country like Greece or Portugal. The Canadian government should use that flexibility to help Canadians safeguard themselves against this difficult period. The balance sheet of the federal government is no great comfort to the average Canadian family if the average Canadian family finds themselves struggling and finding it very difficult to make ends meet.
Any more questions?
Just one last one. You mentioned diversifying trade as well. Do you not think the trade agenda is pretty active from the TPP?
It's pretty late. This is a government that spent its first 4 or 5 years in office alienating what should have been our biggest trading partners. And now, in the last year or so, they suddenly develop an interest in China and in other countries in Asia in particular. Canada had a very strong relationship with China, built up meticulously through the 1990s and up until 2006. Mr. Harper soured the atmosphere, lost 5 or 6 years when we could have been making very good progress in the relationship with China. Postponing things like the landing rights and so forth, which we could have achieved a lot earlier if this government hadn't been on an agenda that basically wrote China off. Now, lately, they're getting into the game, and that's a helpful thing, depending on how they do it. But it's a good 5 or 6 years late.